The cardiologist had barely left the room. Significant ventricular dysfunction, ejection fraction below 30%, will need to reassess over the next 48 hours, when my mother leaned across the bedrail and pressed her lips to my ear. Finally, she breathed. Now everything can be sorted the right way. From the chair beside the window, my brother's voice, casual as someone commenting on the weather, I'll start making calls about the Kawartha property. No point letting it sit. I lay perfectly still. I kept my eyes shut. The cardiac monitor beeped its slow, indifferent rhythm above my head, and I breathed carefully, deliberately, the way you breathe when you are listening and do not want anyone to know it. Their footsteps crossed the tile and disappeared into the hallway. The moment the door swung closed, I opened my eyes. I stared at the ceiling of the cardiac unit at Queensway General, and the first clear thought I had was not about my heart. It was about a dock, a gray, weathered dock on a narrow lake 3 hours northeast of Toronto, where my father used to sit every August morning with a thermos of black coffee, watching the mist burn off the water before the day got away from him. A dock I'd helped him replank, board by board, the summer I was 14. Before I tell you what happened next, and I will tell you everything, you need to understand something. This betrayal wasn't born the day my heart started failing. It was planted decades ago, in every birthday I funded when my brother forgot to budget for his own children's gifts. In every spa trip my mother took on the credit card I'd quietly paid off. In every Christmas I spent pretending I didn't notice them calculating what was mine. I told myself it was love. It wasn't. It was the oldest kind of transaction, tolerance in exchange for checks. My name is Sylvie. I'm 41 years old. I'm a chartered professional accountant with 17 years of practice behind me. And, for most of my adult life, I've been very good at reading the numbers in other people's finances and very stupid about the numbers in my own family. My father, Edmund, was not stupid about anything. He was a man who wore the same 3 pairs of work boots in rotation and called it sensible inventory management. He'd spent 30 years as a millwright at the paper mill in Trenton, and what he built from that salary, slowly, carefully, without ever once asking anyone for help, was a small empire of patience, a house that was paid off by the time I graduated university. An RRSP that nobody knew about until he died. And the property on Burnt Lake in the Kawarthas, which he'd bought for $40,000 in 1987, when $40,000 was more than he'd ever spent on anything, and which he called, without irony, his monument to the fact that working men are allowed to have beautiful things. I was his helper on that property. Not because I was the eldest. My brother, 2 years younger, was always available in theory and absent in practice. But because I showed up, every long weekend, every Labor Day, every Easter, when the ice was just thin enough to make it adventurous. I learned to re-shingle a roof on that property. I learned to winterize pipes, to replace a dock cleat, to read a county zoning map. My father taught me all of it in the particular language of men who show love by showing you something useful. My mother stopped coming to the lake after the second summer. She said the bugs were insufferable. The truth was that the lake had no room for her performance. There were no neighbors to impress up there. Just water and rock and the sound of loons, and my father's refusal to pretend that any of it needed to be more than it already was. She and my father separated when I was 24. By then I'd already understood that my mother had always measured love in real estate values, and my father had never once been for sale. When he died a stroke 6 years ago, very fast, the way he'd have wanted, his estate attorney read a will that my mother had not been shown in advance. Everything to me. The Kawartha property, the RRSP balance, the small investment account. A letter, written in his neat machine shop print, explaining that he'd watched my brother borrow money for 15 years and had watched my mother spend it for 30, and he trusted the person who showed up to guard the things he'd built. My brother didn't speak to me for 8 months after the reading. My mother told everyone at her book club that my father had clearly not been of sound mind in his final years. She still came to my dinners at Christmas. She still let me cover her condo fees when the quarterly levy went up. She still called me every Sunday. I kept answering. I kept paying. I told myself that keeping peace with family was a form of wisdom. I was wrong. It was cowardice dressed up in patience. Lying in that hospital bed with the monitor beeping over my head, I finally understood the price of that cowardice. And I decided, with the particular cold clarity that appears when you have narrowly avoided death, and the people who love you are already divvying up your things, that I was not going to pay it anymore. I pressed the call button. He came that evening, the way I'd known he would. I'd barely finished leaving the voicemail when the night nurse told me I had a visitor, a tall man in his late 60s, wearing a Carhartt vest over a flannel shirt, smelling faintly of wood smoke and chainsaw oil. He'd driven 3 hours from the lake. His name was Orville, and he had been the caretaker of the Burnt Lake property since 1996. He'd replaced the dock 3 times. He'd found my father sitting very still on the porch the morning after his first small stroke, 4 years before the big one, and driven him to the hospital without telling anyone because my father had asked him not to cause a fuss. He stood at the foot of my bed and looked at the monitors with an expression I can only describe as quiet fury. "Your mother called me this morning," he said, "to let me know I should start thinking about the transition." I already knew what transition meant in her vocabulary. It meant my brother would be the new owner. It meant Orville would be out of a job he'd held for nearly 3 decades. It meant the property my father had spent 30 years protecting would be listed on MLS before the snow melted. "Orville," I said, "I need your help, and I want you to know that." "Stop right there." He held up one large, rough hand. "Whatever speech you're about to give me about money, save it. Your father was my friend. You don't pay for that." He sat down in the visitor's chair and folded his arms across his chest. "Tell me everything the doctors told you, from the beginning." I told him. Low ejection fraction. Uncertain prognosis, the word significant used in several places where doctors use it to soften the word bad. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I had a neighbor up the lake, about 8 years back, similar diagnosis, his family was already picking out coffins." A pause. "He's still up at the lake, grows his own tomatoes now, because his son-in-law drove him to Toronto General and got a second opinion." It was not a gentle suggestion, it was an order, delivered by someone who had watched too many people accept the first verdict out of exhaustion. "I have a contact," he said, producing his phone from his vest pocket. "Cardiologist, works at Yushen now. He helped my neighbor. Your father introduced them once, years ago, at some Mill Association dinner. He'll take the call." I made him promise me something first. I told him what I'd heard my mother say in that hospital room, all of it. He listened without expression, and when I was finished, the only sign that any of it had landed was the slow tightening of his jaw. "Right," he said, "then we have work to do." The deal was not made with money. It was sealed in about 40 seconds flat, founded on 30 years of shared loyalty that blood had failed to earn. 2 days later, I was running calculations in my head, the kind a CPA does automatically, like breathing, even when her heart is misfiring, when the head nurse came in with a form attached to a clipboard. I had asked for the healthcare directive paperwork the night before. I signed it before my mother arrived for her morning visit, stripping her of any authority over my medical decisions and naming my lawyer instead. The nurse looked at my signature, then at the door, then back at me. She asked if I was certain. "Completely," I said. 20 minutes later, my mother arrived carrying a foliage arrangement from the florist 2 blocks from her condo. She was wearing her good coat, the charcoal wool one she saved for occasions where impressions mattered. She beamed at the nurses in the hallway. She set the flowers on my windowsill and talked for 11 minutes about how worried she was, how her sleep had been terrible, how she'd told her book club and everyone was praying. Then she reached into her handbag and laid a sheaf of papers on my tray table. "It's just a temporary power of attorney, sweetheart. So your brother and I can manage things while you're recovering. The investment accounts, the lake property. Nobody's going to do anything drastic. We just need to be able to act if necessary." She smiled like a woman who had rehearsed the smile. I looked at the papers. I recognized the letterhead of a solicitor I'd never heard of. A name that appeared, when I later looked into it, on the websites of several companies involved in estate sales for families navigating the deaths of, as the site put it, transitioning loved ones. I picked up the papers. I held them over the tray table for one long moment. My mother's smile remained fixed and expectant. I dropped them on the floor. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "Pick those up and take them with you." She turned a particular shade I'd last seen at the estate reading 6 years ago. Her jaw tightened. For half a second, the smile dropped completely, and I saw underneath it the cold, calculating thing that had always been underneath it, and then the smile came back, thinner this time. "You're not well, Sylvie. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said, "and I'd like you to leave." She gathered the papers off the floor on her way out. Her composure held until the door, and then I heard her voice in the hallway, low and tight, already on the phone to my brother. The precise moment the door clicked shut, my own phone lit up. Dr. Arsenal, from the cardiac division at Toronto General. He'd reviewed my full chart, transferred that morning through proper medical channels with my written consent, which I had given the night before. His voice was calm and direct. "Mrs. Colton," he said, "what you have is not what you've been told. Based on your imaging and the pattern of your enzyme levels, this is almost certainly stress cardiomyopathy. Takotsubo syndrome. Your heart function will, in the vast majority of cases, recover completely with appropriate treatment. You are not dying." I reached over and turned the tap on in the small bathroom sink so no one in the hallway could hear. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed and pressed my fist against my mouth, and I cried, really cried, the kind of crying that bypasses dignity entirely, for about 4 minutes, not because I was going to live, because I'd had 12 hours of believing I might not. And in those 12 hours, the only people who'd seen an opportunity were the two who were supposed to be devastated. When the 4 minutes were over, I splashed cold water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. And I thought about my father, and his patience, and his precise, particular way of understanding that preparation and timing were everything. I had time, I was not going to waste it. Orville became my forward intelligence. It turned out that a man who has quietly maintained a property for 28 years is effectively invisible to the people who never looked at him properly to begin with. He moved through spaces where people didn't think to be careful. He photographed the document spread across my brother's kitchen table during their first planning session. Orville had been let in to fix a dripping pipe and finish the job in 40 minutes with the quiet efficiency of someone who is very good at what he does and even better at appearing to be only that. He noted the names of the 2 real estate agents my brother had contacted for a preliminary valuation of the Kawartha property. He kept a log. He delivered everything through a system we'd agreed on, drafted emails to an account I'd created from my phone, sent from a tablet he'd bought at the Walmart in Lindsay with cash. Meanwhile, I arranged for Constance to visit. Constance was my estate lawyer, and she had been my estate lawyer since the year my father died, and I'd needed someone to help me navigate probate. She was 53, wore her hair in a tight gray bun, and had the particular manner of a woman who had spent 20 years in family law watching people behave appallingly and had decided the most useful response was extreme thoroughness. She arrived at the hospital on a Thursday afternoon carrying a get-well bouquet from the gift shop downstairs and the face of someone paying a routine visit to a sick friend. The second the door was locked, she put the bouquet on the window ledge and opened her leather folio. "I've reviewed everything Orville sent," she said. "Your mother's solicitor filed a notice of application for guardianship of property. It won't succeed, you're manifestly capable, but it's designed to take up time and legal fees and make you look erratic." She laid out what she'd prepared. An irrevocable trust in my father's name to be registered with the county immediately, all significant assets transferred into it, my brother and mother removed from any possible inheritance position. A set of trustees, Constance, a colleague of hers, and a representative from a land conservancy she'd identified, who would oversee the property going forward. "Your instructions for the trust," she said, sliding a page across the tray table. "Take your time." I read the document twice, then I picked up the pen. I paused on the section that formally removed my brother. I thought about a specific Saturday when he was 7 and I was 9, on the dock at Burnt Lake, when he'd capsized a canoe and I'd pulled him out of the cold water, because my father was up at the cabin and my mother wasn't there at all. I thought about how he'd cried and I'd held his wet head in my lap on the dock until he stopped shaking. I thought about the voicemail I'd heard him leave the real estate agent, crisp and businesslike, asking about comparable waterfront sales in the Kawartha Lakes region. I pressed the pen down hard. I signed. Constance gathered the originals into her folio, said she'd file before the court office closed, and left the way she'd come. She took the get-well bouquet with her. She'd bought it for exactly this purpose. My mother organized a gathering at her condo 3 weeks after my discharge. She called it a recovery dinner. She'd had the caterers in, called my extended family and several of her closest friends, people who had known my father, people who held weight in the small community of relationships we all lived inside together. Orville texted me the guest list the day before. He'd gotten it from the caterer's confirmation email, which my mother had CC'd to him by mistake when she'd clicked the wrong entry in her address book. I read the list and understood immediately what the dinner was for. She needed witnesses, a room full of sympathetic people who could later testify, if it came to that she had been a devoted and exhausted parent in the months leading up to her daughter's unfortunate estate decisions. She needed to build the narrative in person, in a room full of people who trusted her, before any of it went to paper. I called Orville. "I'll be there," I said. A pause. "Should I come?" "Yes," I said, "but you don't have to stay long." I arrived 20 minutes after the guests were seated. I'd taken extra care with my appearance, not out of vanity, but because my mother had always used the way I looked as evidence of how I was doing, and I wanted there to be no ambiguity about where I stood. The room went quiet when I walked in. My mother was mid-sentence, center of the room, holding a glass of Riesling and wearing an expression of practiced tragedy. She saw me, and her face went through several things in rapid succession that she couldn't quite control. "Sylvie." She recovered fast. She was always fast. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't have driven." "Thank you for organizing this," I said. "I'm glad everyone's here." I set my bag down on the sideboard and took out my phone. I'd attached a small external microphone to it 2 days earlier, the kind that picks up a room clearly and fits in your palm. Before we sit down, I said, I'd like everyone to hear something. My mother moved toward me. I took one step back. I pressed play. The room heard her voice first, the way it sounded when she thought no one important was listening, clipped and businesslike, the warmth entirely gone. The property will be worth considerably more if we move before spring. If she stabilizes, we may have to reconsider the guardianship approach and try something slower. Then my brother's voice, agreeable and barely interested, the voice he used when he was thinking about something else. What about the CPA practice? Are those assets even separable? The recording was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I had 26 minutes of material. 4 minutes and 17 seconds was enough. When it finished, the room was very still. My mother's oldest friend, a woman named Paulette, who'd known her since teacher's college, set down her wine glass and looked at my mother with an expression I had never seen on her face before, and I'd known her since I was 6 years old. My mother's voice when it came was shrill and climbing. She's not well. The medication, she doesn't understand what she's saying. I'm not on any medication, I said. My cardiologist at Toronto General confirmed I'm in full recovery. The written summary is in my bag if anyone would like to read it. My brother had gone the color of old chalk. He didn't say a word. He'd always done his worst damage in private. In public, he folded. I reached into my bag and took out the trust documentation, the registered, filed, irrevocable trust in Edmund Colton's name, stamped by the county clerk's office. The Burnt Lake property, my father's investment accounts, and all associated assets are held in trust, I said. Permanently. Neither of them has any claim to any of it. If there are further legal challenges, and I expect there will be, my lawyer will be happy to respond. I looked at my mother across that room, the woman who had pressed her lips to my ear in the cardiac unit and breathed finally like a prayer she'd been holding for years. I think we're done here, I said. I picked up my bag. Orville, who had been standing quietly near the door the entire time, held it open for me. We left. My mother hired a lawyer within the week. The application challenged the trust on the grounds of undue influence, the argument being that my fragile health state had made me susceptible to manipulation by a third party, meaning Orville, and mental incapacity at the time of signing. Constance handled it the way she handled everything, with methodical, unhurried precision. Dr. Arsenault provided a sworn affidavit confirming my cognitive capacity at every relevant point. The hospital records showed I had taken multiple independent legal actions, the healthcare directive, the initial consultation with Constance, before Orville had visited a second time. The timeline demolished the narrative cleanly. My brother submitted an affidavit claiming I'd been erratic and combative during my illness. Constance submitted the full recording with a certified transcript. The application was dismissed. The trust stood. The judge noted, in her closing remarks, that the evidence suggested the opposing party's concern had been primarily for the estate rather than the applicant's welfare, and that this was not a legitimate basis for a guardianship claim. My mother sat across the aisle from me in that courtroom, and she looked like a woman who had been running a very long calculation and had finally had someone check her work. She said something as I stood to leave. Something about how she was still, my mother and family was family, and she hoped I'd remember that. I walked out into the February air and did not answer. The following May, Orville planted a new row of white pines along the drive up to the Burnt Lake cabin. My father had always meant to do it. Orville had a long memory for things my father had always meant to do. I called him inside for coffee and sat him down at the old table where my father used to spread out his RRSP statements and his fishing maps, treating them with equal seriousness. I slid a document across the table. I'd transferred a block of shares from a small real estate holding company into his name, paired with a retirement package that included full coverage for himself and his wife Marguerite. It was enough that he would never need to worry about the winters. He'd spent 28 of them worrying about mine. His hands that had spent decades doing physical work that most people never think about. He looked out the window at the lake. Then he pressed his lips together hard, the way men of his generation do when they are not going to cry, but need a moment. He nodded once. That was all. I also told him what the Colton Trust was going to do with the property. Not sell it. Not sit on it. My father had talked in his last years about a summer program for young people in Crown Care, kids in the foster system, kids who aged out of it without anywhere to land. He'd thought a week at a lake might give a child something solid to stand on, something they could carry forward. He'd never gotten around to organizing it. He'd run out of time. The trust was going to organize it. Starting the following summer, Burnt Lake would host 2-week-long sessions every August for young people in care, in partnership with a family services organization based in Peterborough. Constance had handled the registration. The county had been supportive. The local MP's office had expressed interest in attending the inaugural session. Orville sat with this information for a long moment. He'd have liked that, he said finally. Yes, I said, he would have. My brother sends messages occasionally. They started as accusations, what I'd stolen from him, what I'd denied him, what the lawyers were going to do. Then they shifted, the way they always shift with people like him, to something smaller and more revealing. Guilt about his children's school fees, his marriage being strained, how a good sister would find a way to help. As though the word sister still had the power to open my wallet. It doesn't. I blocked the number on a Tuesday in March, the same day the ice went out on Burnt Lake, 2 weeks earlier than usual, which Orville said was worth paying attention to. I stood on the dock my father and I had rebuilt together, board by board, the summer I was 14, and I watched the last of it drift and dissolve in the thin afternoon light. My mother has not contacted me. Whether that reflects legal advice, pride, or something approaching self-awareness, I can't say. I stopped trying to read her motivations. She is what she is. I am what I choose to be. I drove up to the lake on the first warm weekend of June. Orville had the dock ready, the canoe turned right side up, the cabin aired out after the winter. He'd left a thermos of coffee on the railing, black, the way my father had always taken it, the way I'd learned to take it somewhere along 30 years of showing up. I stood on that dock in the morning quiet, with the thermos warm in both hands, and the lake doing what lakes in Ontario do in early June, shifting between mirror flat and dimpled with whatever small wind moves through when nobody's paying particular attention. And I thought about what my father had said in that kitchen in Peterborough when I was 9 years old. Your mother and your brother will always want what you have. The question is whether you'll be paying attention. I was paying attention now. The loons were out, the pair that nested somewhere in the reeds east of the dock, loud, unabashed, utterly indifferent to anyone's plans for them. I raised my coffee toward my father's old Muskoka chair, the one with the cracked arm that Orville had been threatening to replace for years and never quite did. And I didn't say anything out loud. There wasn't anything to say. He'd known how it would go. He'd trusted me to handle it when it did. The war for the things he'd built was finished. The things he'd built were still standing. So was I.